User preferences are an important part of any notification system. They let users customize their product experience so that they only get alerts about things they care about on the channels that are important to them. Knock provides developers with a powerful Preferences API that lets you model a user's preferences at a pretty granular level. In this quick start video, we'll cover how to model a user's preferences in Knock, how to build a basic PreferenceCenter component in React, and then we'll look at how Knock applies those preferences during workflow runs so that you can view and debug them in your logs. So let's get started. So I have our preferences concept page open at docs.knock.app/concepts/preferences. And this gives just a really quick highlight of what preferences are and what they can do. And if we look at this UI example right here, you've probably seen this in a lot of different applications. Maybe you already have one. But this sort of mechanism allows users to opt in and out of different channels based on either workflows or workflow categories. And there's a lot of additional things that we can do as well. So I'm going to click here and go through this preferences overview page, which takes us one layer deeper. And all of Knock's preference API is built around the idea of a preference set. And so a preference set is basically a JSON-like object that tells Knock which channels and categories or workflows a user has opted out of. And so we can see what the structure of that looks like here. So for example, we have this categories key, maybe you have an admin category and that is false. That means that the user wouldn't get notifications on workflows that are in the category of admin. We can opt out at the channel type level, right? So this would basically be telling Knock, hey, don't send any emails. So we've got channel types and then a key of email where we can have users opt out of entire channel types. Now, this isn't always the best option. I tend to recommend that people find a more granular way to let people opt out, although we also have the ability to override some of those user preferences. And lastly, we can see this example of workflows, right? Where we've got this workflows key, maybe there's a mention workflow and the user's opted out of that one. Now, what we can do is we can combine all of those individual keys into a JSON object that looks like this, where we have categories with several categories in there, workflows with a workflow key, but then we can also nest this channel types object inside of an individual workflow or category so that we can give people really granular preferences. And so essentially that boils down to something that looks like this. And so I'm going to go ahead and open up this interactive example app just so we can sort of see how these things interact. So right here over on the left, we have this example preference set JSON object. And over here, we have these different checkbox toggles. So as I toggle them, you can see that the value of this in-app feed key right there is updating based on the way that I'm checking this checkbox. So as the user manipulates this part of the UI, we essentially update this JSON object and then reset that back into Knock. So now the next thing that we would want to do is build your preference center. Okay, and so we recommend that every environment have a default preference set, right? So what that does is that is basically an option inside of the dashboard if we come down to preferences where the admin of that environment can basically specify a default preference set. So what is the role of default preference set? That means that if the user has not specified their own preferences using this JSON structure, Knock will default to using this default preference set. It's also really helpful in creating basically the structure of the preference center that you want to display to the user. Now, there is one thing to call out here is that when we create a default preference set, that Knock actually merges those preferences with the preferences that the user has specified to create sort of one preference set. So if there are things in here that the user hasn't specified, those will be merged in, and we'll see an example of that once we actually get into building the preference set. Now, really the first part of this sort of four-step process, which step one is creating a default preference set. Then basically we're going to create a component, and inside that component, we need to fetch a user's preferences from Knock using their user ID. Then we render some sort of interface for them. And here's a good example of what we'll build in the next step. And then ultimately, once the user makes some changes, we're just going to set that JSON object back into that user's preferences. So here you can see we use the users.setPreferences method to go ahead and update that user's preferences. Now what we'll do is we're going to follow this link and we're going to run through the quick start guide for building preference UIs in React. Okay, and so I'm going to follow the instructions in this guide using one of the example apps that you can find up here in example apps. It's the Notion feed example, but you should also be able to follow along with this guide on your own or in your own application, because ultimately that's the deployment target for this. So to get started, what we recommend is that you've reviewed the preference documentation we just went over. Then you've also set a default preference set for your environment. And then what we'll need to do is obviously we need an API key to authenticate our client, and then we'll also want to install this dependency. I've already done that, so we'll skip that step for this. And then we also recommend just modeling your preferences, right? Thinking a little bit about what it is that you want to expose to the user, whether those are categories or workflows, and all of the code samples in this are basically based off of this example. So the first thing that we'll do is inside of our project, we're going to create a PreferenceCenter.jsx file, and then we're going to import a couple of these hooks from React and import the NOC client. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy that code sample. We'll hop over here into my project where I will create a new file called PreferenceCenter. And then I'll do .tsx, and then inside of here, we'll go ahead and just paste this information. Now, I am already using a user ID that is stored in an environment variable for this project, and I believe that is NOC. Let's actually just go grab it out here. So next public NOC user ID. And we'll also go ahead and change this as well so that we get the right API key. So here what we've done is we've imported some stuff that we'll need later from React. We've also created a new NOC client instance and authenticated that with a user, right? That's very important because this NOC client needs to be tied to a particular user to be able to pull that user's preferences. Now, the next step of this is to create what we're going to call a preferences view config. Now, this is going to be a configuration object that's essentially going to help us generate the interface that we want to show to the end user. Now, this has two different objects inside of it. The first is row settings, which are basically going to correspond to each row of that preferences grid like we looked at in the previous example. Those are going to have a key that corresponds to either a workflow or a category, some entry in our preference set that we download from NOC. And then we're going to have a title and description, which are just human readable labels for these things so that it's a little bit easier to use. Then we're also going to create a secondary object called channel type labels, which is going to do something similar. Each one of these corresponds to a particular channel type that we might find in those channel type settings. And then we provide a human readable label. And this is also how you would add additional channels to the UI that we're going to create. So we'll go ahead and just copy this example, flip back into our code for now, and I'm just going to paste that down here. So let's do that. We've got our preference view config. And again, this is just a configuration file that we're going to use to power that end user interface, provide these nice titles and descriptions for them. And so we'll hop back into the code example and walk through to the next step. Now, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create a secondary component that is going to generate each one of our preference setting rows. Now, here we're passing in a couple of different things, like what type of preference is this? Is it a workflow? Is it a category? We're going to pass in the key of the preference, which is going to correspond to the key of the preference in the preference set. Then we'll also pass in the current channel type settings, right? Because when we load a user's preferences from NOC, they may already have settings that they've set themselves or that they have been set as a part of the preference defaults. So we're going to load those, and then we're also going to pass in an onChange function, which is what's going to handle updating our users' preferences in NOC whenever they make a change. And we can see here that all we're really doing is we're rendering out some information from the preference view config. So we're going to display the title, we're going to display the description, and then we're going to map over the channel types and basically return an input and a label for each channel type setting. So there will be one for email, one for in-app, one for each of the channels that you specify in that config object above. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and we'll hop back into our code, and we can paste that here. And you see I'm using TypeScript, so we're just going to get a couple of errors, which we'll just ignore for right now. And we'll keep going. And you can see that as we go through this guide, each one of these steps is broken down for you and sort of explaining what we're doing in real time. And here you can see an example of what that onChange function looks like. And the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually compose our PreferenceCenter component. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that code sample, and we'll hop back into our code project. And then we can go ahead and put that in there and save. And we'll hop back out to the docs and sort of just walk through what's happening. So one of the things that we need to do is obviously this component needs to store a user's preferences in local state. So we create a use state hook and a method of getting and setting those preferences. And then inside of a use effect, when this component renders, we're going to fetch the user's current preferences. So we use the knock client for that, where we call user.getPreferences, and then we're going to set those preferences into that local preferences state variable that we created right above. Now, here's what our onPreferenceChange handler looks like. Now, this is the updating part of creating that PreferenceCenter. We're going to pass in a preference key, preference type, and again, those channel type settings. So what channel type updates are we making? Then we're going to basically create a temporary object to store the updates for our preference. Because one of the things to know about the preference API with knock is that we don't want to update part of a preference set. When we call get and set preferences, we want to be passing the entire preference set every time we make an update. If we pass a partial one, it will basically be destructive and override that, and we'll only have a partial representation of the user's preferences. So we want to be passing the entire preference set each time we call set preferences. And then here we're basically just looking at what type of preference update we're making. Is this a category or is this a workflow? And then we're setting those channel types to the channel type settings that we passed in, basically the updates that the user has made. Then we call user.setPreferences with that preference update object passed. And then we're going to resync those local preferences with the update that we made in knock. So here we update knock, update the user's preferences in knock, and then set local preferences here so that the user can see those changes. And then basically here we have just an if statement where if we haven't rendered those local preferences or haven't loaded the local preferences yet, we return null. And then down here is where the actual meat of the component happens. This is where we render out those preference setting rows. And you can see what that looks like. We're looping through the object, the keys of the preference categories, the preference workflows, mapping over them, and then returning a preference setting row for each one of those items. And then really the last thing that we need to do is deploy, use our preference center. So here we have a fully functional preference center. If we hop back into our code, we should be able to come back out to our activity feed component. And this is where I'm going to put my preference center. So we'll go ahead and do preference center. And then we should need, maybe it's imported it for us already. Looks like it has. And so then if we go ahead and save this file and start up our dev server, should be able to hop out to localhost 3000 and see this in action. And so if I toggle this modal, I get this really nice preference grid out of the box. We can see that some of these pieces of data are being powered by our preference view config, and we're also pulling in some data from the user's preference set, which is inheriting from the preference default set. If I make changes to this behind the scenes, the knock client is going to make an API call to update that user's preference set. So if I go to inspect and open up the network tab, every time I toggle one of these checkboxes, you can see that API call being made, where we're basically resetting that entire preference set for that user. So that's really cool. But let's look at how we would use this in combination with the default preference set. So you can see here that a couple of these checkbox options are disabled. It's because there isn't a channel type setting for email or push. Now let's say we wanted to enable an email channel type setting in this in-app messages workflow category option. We'd head out to our default preference set, and inside of this channel types object, let's add another key for email, and then we'll set that to true. Won't forget our comma here, and we'll go ahead and save that. And then if we reload this user's preference set, we should see how that merge behavior works. Because the user didn't have a value specified for email as a part of their own recipient level preference set, Knock merged the two together. Because there was no recipient level preference there, it inherited the value from the default preference set. So that's great and is a really handy way to allow you to manage what types of preference options the user is going to see in the interface. So we've spent a lot of time talking about how to build this interface, but let's take it one level deeper and actually look at how these preferences work as a part of workflows. So let's say, for example, that a user wanted to opt out of this comments and mentions workflow and the in-app feed level. So they deselect this to opt them out of that channel. So let's head back into the dashboard and let's open up that new comment workflow. And we'll run a test. So we'll go ahead and send this to that particular user. And if we click run test, then we should be able to view all of the logs about that particular request. So I'll open that in a new tab. And here we can see that there's the API trigger that generated the tests and all of our payload data, but we can also open up the individual workflow runs. So if we open up that workflow run for that particular user, we can see here that when we get to that in-app feed channel step, that user has opted out. So when we click in there, we can see no message generated. This recipient has opted out of receiving notifications from this workflow. And if we actually look at the trigger step, we can see the entire preference set that Knock used to actually evaluate whether or not it should send that notification. So here in new comment, we can see the in-app feed option channel setting is false, and that's why that user didn't receive that particular workflow. So this is super helpful if you're ever trying to answer the question, why did or didn't a user receive a particular notification on a particular channel? Using the workflow run logs, you get all of this observability into how preferences are being applied and across different channels. So it gives you a really full picture of why or why not somebody received a particular notification. Hopefully that gives you a really good idea of how all of the different preference mechanisms work together in Knock to help you send better notifications to your end users. So thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments.